Logan Prescott stood in the marble bathroom of the Sterling, staring at a man he almost didn't recognize. Same jaw, same eyes. Different uniform, polyester faded gray, smelling faintly of bleach. He wasn't broke. He wasn't desperate. He was a billionaire who had spent 40 minutes convincing a hotel janitor to trade clothes because his father had scheduled a blind date, and Logan had every intention of killing it before the appetizers arrived. He smoothed the front of the uniform, straightened the name tag. Marcus. The dining floor was exactly what he expected. Candlelight crystal glasses, the soft clink of old money being polite. He moved through it like furniture, invisible, exactly as planned. He was halfway to the observation point when he saw her. She wasn't at the reserved table. She wasn't in a gown. She was leaning against the service corridor wall in the same gray uniform, the same faded stitching, holding a mop. She clearly had no idea how to use. 3 hours before he put on that uniform, Logan Prescott had been sitting at the head of a conference table on the 42nd floor of Prescott Group's Manhattan headquarters, reviewing a zoning proposal for a development project in Jersey City. His assistant had just refilled his coffee. His calendar showed nothing after 6 o'clock. It was supposed to be a quiet Thursday. Then his father walked in without knocking. Harold Prescott was 71 years old and had never once in his life asked for something he could simply announce instead. He set a folded card on the table in front of Logan, a reservation slip, the Sterling 8 o'clock table for 2, and clasped his hands behind his back like a man who had already won the argument. Walter Calloway's daughter, Harold said. Her name is Audrey. She's 32. She runs the design division of Calloway & Sons, and she's going to be at that table tonight, whether you are or not. Logan didn't touch the card. I'm not doing this. The Calloway contract is worth $240 million over 5 years. Harold's voice didn't rise. It never did. If this partnership doesn't close, we restructure. And when we restructure, the first thing that goes is the Riverside expansion, which means 200 people out of work before Christmas. The room felt smaller than it had 60 seconds ago. Logan picked up the card. He looked at it for a long moment. The gold embossing the careful handwriting, the weight of everything his father knew how to pack into a single gesture. Then he set it back down and said very quietly, I'll be there. Harold nodded once and left. Logan sat alone at the head of the table and thought about the last time he had agreed to something like this. He'd been 28. Her name was Diana. She had laughed at all his jokes and touched his arm when she talked, and told him on their wedding night that she had always dreamed of a life like this. Not a life with him specifically, but a life like this. He had understood the difference eventually. It had taken 2 years, and 1 daughter and a car accident on a rain-slicked highway outside of Providence to fully close that chapter. Stella was 6 now. She still slept with the nightlight on and asked her babysitter to leave the hall door cracked, and every night when Logan came home late, she would appear at the top of the stairs in her yellow pajamas and say, "You're back," like she hadn't entirely believed he would be. He was not going to let anyone into that house who was there for the wrong reasons, which was exactly why at 6:45 that evening, he was standing in a service corridor of the Sterling, negotiating with a janitor named Marcus over the temporary loan of 1 gray polyester uniform. The idea had come to him in the car. It was impulsive and probably undignified, and he didn't care. The logic was clean. Arrive in disguise, observe Audrey Calloway before she knew she was being observed, and watch how she treated the people around her who couldn't do anything for her. If she was what he expected, polished, transactional, allergic to anyone below her tax bracket, he would have his evidence. He would go back to his father and say, "I was there. I watched. This is not the person you think she is," and that would be the end of it. He had called his assistant Derek on the way over and explained the second part of the plan. "You want me to sit at the table?" Derek said. "In my jacket." "Yes. And pretend to be you. You don't have to pretend very hard. Just order the tasting menu and look like you'd rather be somewhere else." Derek had worn the jacket without further complaint. He was good at that. Logan, meanwhile, had clipped on Marcus's name tag, rolled up the slightly too long sleeves, and stepped out onto the floor of the most expensive restaurant in Manhattan, looking like a man who cleaned up after other people for a living. The maitre d' didn't glance at him. A woman in a silk dress stepped around him without breaking her conversation. A busboy nodded at him in passing solidarity. Invisible. Exactly as planned. He positioned himself near a service column, with a clear sightline to table 9, the reserved table, and waited. What he had not planned for was Audrey Calloway. Not because of the uniform, though that came later. What he hadn't planned for was the moment 12 minutes into his surveillance, when a man in a charcoal blazer, the kind of man who wore pocket squares, unironically snapped his fingers at a young server named, according to her name tag, Rosa. Rosa had been carrying a tray of water glasses. The man's elbow caught her arm. The water went down the front of her uniform. The tray hit the floor with a sound like a small catastrophe, and before Rosa could say anything, the man turned to his table companions and said loudly enough to carry, "These people genuinely cannot do the simplest job." Rosa went very still, the kind of still that meant she was deciding very carefully whether she could afford to respond. She couldn't. Logan knew it. She knew it. Someone else apparently had a different opinion. A woman in a gray janitor's uniform stepped out of the service corridor, set her mop against the wall, with the focused calm of someone putting down something they intended to pick back up, and walked directly to the man's table. "She didn't spill that," the woman said. Her voice was even unhurried with the particular quality of someone who had no doubt they were correct. "Your elbow did. There's a difference, and I think you know that." The man looked up. He was the kind of man who was not accustomed to being addressed by staff. "Excuse me. Rosa is going to get a clean towel," the woman continued, "and you are going to let her do her job. That's all." She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds longer than was comfortable, then turned and walked back to her mop. The man said nothing. His dining companions studied their menus with sudden intensity. Rosa, who had been standing frozen, exhaled. Logan watched all of this from behind his service column, with the specific expression of a man whose careful assumptions were developing cracks. He had come here expecting to find a reason to leave. Instead, he found himself crossing the floor before he had consciously decided to. The woman in the gray uniform had retrieved her mop and was heading toward the service corridor when Logan fell into step beside her. She glanced at him, measured, assessing, and didn't slow down. "That was either very brave or very reckless," Logan said. "It was neither." She pushed through this corridor door. "It was just accurate." He followed her into the hallway, which was narrow and lit with the flat overhead light of spaces not meant to be seen. She set the mop in its rack and turned to face him with the expression of someone who had just noticed something slightly off. "You're not actually on the cleaning crew," she said. It wasn't a question. Logan looked at her. The uniform was the right size, fitted in a way that suggested it hadn't been borrowed from a man 6 inches taller than her. Her hands were smooth. The way she held herself, weight-centered, shoulders back, was not the posture of someone accustomed to physical labor. "Neither are you," he said. She didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it. She leaned against the wall and crossed her arms and regarded him with the careful neutrality of someone deciding how much to give away. "I'm Audrey," she said finally. He should have recognized the name instantly. He didn't, or rather he did, but somewhere below the level where it registered as dangerous. Audrey was a common name. The woman in front of him in a borrowed uniform who had just publicly corrected a man twice her social rank on behalf of a stranger did not match any version of Audrey Calloway he had constructed in his head. "Logan," he said. She nodded slowly, as though filing it away. In the dining room at table 9, Derek was doing his best. He had ordered the tasting menu as instructed. He had accepted the wine list with what he hoped was the expression of a man accustomed to wine lists. He had been sitting across from a young woman who had introduced herself as Cassie Bright, a little nervous, talking fast, and who had, in the last 10 minutes, volunteered more information about her cousin than Derek had asked for. Audrey is brilliant, obviously, Cassie said, turning her water glass in small rotations. But she's, you know how some people are just a lot. She has very specific ideas about everything. What she wants, what she doesn't want. Very hard to surprise. She smiled the smile of someone who believed they were being generous. I just want you to know what you're getting into, in case that matters. Derek smiled back and thought Logan is going to owe me significantly more than my annual bonus. In the service corridor, Logan and Audrey had been talking for 11 minutes. He had told her he was between jobs. He'd set it to test her to see what she did with the information, whether her interest recalibrated. She had listened without any visible shift in attention, and then said, "What kind of work are you looking for?" "Something that doesn't make me feel like a transaction," he said, and was surprised to find he meant it. She was quiet for a moment, turning something over. Then, "Do you have kids?" The question landed unexpectedly. He almost deflected. Instead, he said, "One. A daughter. She's 6. What's her name? Stella." Audrey's expression did something he couldn't quite name. Not pity. Not the performed warmth people offered when they wanted to seem warm. Something quieter and more careful. "She's the reason I'm still trying," Logan said, "to believe that people are mostly decent. She makes it harder to stop." Audrey looked at him for a long moment. A beat passed between them, unhurried, the kind that only happened when two people had mutually decided to stop performing. "That's the least cynical thing I've heard in a very long time," she said, and her voice had changed slightly. Not softer exactly, but less guarded. Like a door that had been sitting shut for a long time, opened just enough to let light through. Logan was trying to think of how to respond when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. Derek's name on the screen. He answered. Derek's voice came through at full, unmoderated volume, the way it did when Derek forgot that phones carried sound in both directions. "Hey, Logan. So the Calloway girl never showed. There's just a cousin here. Should I wrap this up? Or?" Logan looked up. Audrey was already looking at him. The name had landed between them like something dropped from a height. He watched her face change, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the small, specific way that faces change when two things that were separate suddenly become one thing. She knew who he was. He knew who she was. Neither of them said anything. Logan lowered the phone. Audrey pushed off the wall, straightened her uniform once, a reflexive, composed gesture, and walked to the corridor door. She didn't run. She didn't explain. She just left. Logan stood in the service hallway under the flat overhead light, holding a phone with a still open call, wearing a dead man's name tag, thinking about a woman who had defended a stranger in front of a full dining room, and then told him without knowing who he was that Stella sounded like the best reason she'd heard in years to keep trying. He thought about that for a long time. Then he went to find Derek and tell him the evening was over. They both went home and told the same lie. Logan told his father the evening had been unproductive. Audrey told her father the same. 2 cities, 2 dining rooms, 2 men who received the news with identical expressions of cold displeasure, and then separately began making other plans. Harold Prescott said very little. He had a way of being disappointed that didn't require words. He simply left the conversation with the specific patience of a man who believed the situation would resolve itself in his favor, eventually, because it always had. Walter Calloway in Chicago said considerably more. He told Audrey that she had embarrassed him, that the Prescott partnership was not optional, and that her behavior, whatever it had been, reflected on the entire family. Audrey stood in her father's study and listened to all of it, and said when he finished, "I understand." She did not say he was right. Cassie, sitting at the kitchen island when Audrey got home, looked up from her phone with an expression that was almost sympathy. Almost. "How bad was it?" Cassie asked. "It was fine," Audrey said and went to bed. She lay in the dark for a long time, thinking about a man in a gray uniform who had said his daughter was the reason he still tried to believe people were decent. She thought about the way he had answered that question, not quickly, not with the smooth delivery of someone performing sincerity, but slowly, like he was deciding in real time whether to trust her with it. She thought about his face when Derek's call came through, not guilty exactly, but caught, the way people looked when something they had built to protect themselves suddenly turned around. She had not expected that. She had expected Logan Prescott to be exactly what his file suggested, polished, controlled, the kind of man who made decisions in columns. She had borrowed the uniform because she wanted to see who he was before the table settings and the family expectations arranged themselves between them. She had thought she was being clever. She hadn't counted on him having the same idea. In New York, Logan was awake at 2 in the morning, sitting on the edge of Stella's bed after she'd had a bad dream, watching her breathe. Stella had gone back to sleep quickly, the way children did, with a completeness that adults lost somewhere along the way. Logan stayed longer than he needed to. The nightlight threw a soft orange circle on the ceiling. The hall door was cracked exactly 2 inches. He thought about the corridor at the Sterling. He thought about Audrey saying, "That's the least cynical thing I've heard in a very long time." Not as a compliment exactly, but as something that had caught her off guard, the way a person looked when they heard a truth they had stopped expecting to encounter. He thought about the moment Derek's voice had come through the phone and watched her face change. She hadn't been angry. That was the part he couldn't stop turning over. She had looked at him with something more complicated than anger. Recognition, maybe, or the particular expression of someone who has just understood a joke that was also on them. 2 people, same room, same uniform, same idea. It would have been funny if it hadn't also been the most honest either of them had been all evening. Then she had left. Clean, composed, no scene. He had spent 4 years learning to read people's exits. Hers had not been the exit of a woman who had been playing him. It had been the exit of a woman who needed a moment to think. He did not know what to do with that. He found out her name 4 days later, through channels he was not proud of. Not surveillance, nothing invasive, just the simple architecture of 2 families already in negotiation. A shared document, a contact list, a name he now knew how to attach to a face. Audrey Calloway, head of design, Calloway & Sons, based in Chicago. No public social media worth mentioning. 1 profile photo on the company website that looked like it had been taken against her will. He did not call her. He did not reach out through the families, which would have required explanations he wasn't ready to give. He sat with it instead, which was not something he was practiced at. He reviewed the Calloway portfolio with more attention than it strictly required. He read a profile of Walter Calloway in an industry publication from 3 years prior and found near the end a single quote from Audrey about her approach to commercial design. "The best spaces don't announce themselves. They just make people feel like they can breathe." He read it twice. Meanwhile, someone else was moving faster. Brett Holloway had been Logan's partner for 3 years before Logan had bought him out, cleanly, fairly, with a settlement Brett had agreed to in writing, and then spent the following 18 months resenting in private. Brett was the kind of man who smiled easily and remembered everything, and never let go of a grievance long enough to examine whether it was worth holding. He had been watching the Calloway negotiation since it began. The math was not complicated. If the Calloway contract went to Prescott Group, the combined portfolio would push Prescott's valuation high enough to make a hostile acquisition impossible. But if the contract fell through, if Walter Calloway walked away, there was a window, a narrow one. Brett had spent his career fitting himself through narrow windows, and he was very good at making them look wider than they were. He reached out to Walter Calloway through a mutual contact in the Chicago real estate market, positioning himself as a concerned former colleague with information Walter deserved to have. He suggested over lunch at a restaurant Walter had chosen that Logan Prescott was not as stable as his financials suggested. A widower with a young child, a man with a history of erratic decisions, a man who had just recently failed to appear at a dinner arranged by both families, sending an assistant in his place, which Brett described as insulting, though he said it gently with the expression of a man who hated to be the one delivering the news. Walter listened. He did not commit to anything, but he listened. Brett's second call was to Cassie. He had met her once at an industry event 6 months prior, charming, a little restless, living in the specific frustration of someone who believed they deserved more visibility than they had. He had her number. He used it. He told Cassie he was trying to understand what had actually happened at the Sterling. He said he was asking because he wanted to protect Audrey's reputation. Said it warmly with the practiced concern of a man who had spent years making self-serving things sound altruistic. Cassie had a photograph on her phone. She had taken it that night without entirely knowing why Audrey framed in the service corridor doorway, in the gray uniform, mop in hand. She had thought it was funny at the time. She had thought in the small, unkind corner of herself she didn't examine too closely that it might be useful someday. She sent it to Brett. Audrey had been back in New York for a design consultation, a hotel renovation project in Midtown when it happened. She had finished her site meeting early and was crossing the atrium of the Meridian Center, wheeling a portfolio case, when she heard a child's voice say very clearly and at significant volume, "That's not how you read a map." She turned. A girl maybe 6 years old was standing in the middle of the atrium, holding a fold-out shopping directory upside down. She had brown hair and 2 uneven pigtails and was wearing a jacket with a small star embroidered on the pocket. She was completely alone and appeared entirely unconcerned about this. Audrey crossed to her. "Are you lost?" The girl considered the question seriously. "I know where I am," she said. "I just don't know where the fountain is." "It's on the lower level." Audrey crouched down to be at eye level. "Where's the person you came with? My babysitter went to look for me." The girl tilted her head. "She's probably worried. She worries a lot. My dad says it's because she cares." A small, considered beat. "My dad worries too, but he doesn't call it that." Audrey sat down on the nearby bench and stayed with her. "The way you did. You didn't move a lost child. You stayed visible. You waited." The girl's name, offered with the confidence of someone accustomed to introducing herself, was Stella. The name arrived like a key turning in a lock. Audrey kept her expression even. She asked Stella about the star on her jacket, a birthday present. Stella explained from her dad, who had let her pick it out herself because, and this was offered as established fact, he doesn't know anything about jackets. They talked about the fountain and whether fish could live in fountain water, and whether Stella's school had a fish tank, which it did, and the fish's name was Gerald, which Stella found deeply uninspiring as fish names went. 12 minutes later, a man came through the atrium at the particular speed of someone trying not to look like they were running. Logan Prescott stopped when he saw her. He stood very still for approximately 2 seconds. Then Stella called "Dad," and he crossed to them, and the 3 of them existed in the same 10 square feet of marble atrium floor, with no preparation, and no script, and no borrowed uniforms between them. "She was reading the map upside down," Audrey said. "She does that." Logan looked at his daughter, then back at Audrey. His voice was careful, measured. The voice of a man deciding in real time how much of what he was feeling to let through. "Thank you." Stella looked between them with the frank curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to disguise interest. "Do you know my dad?" "We've met," Audrey said. Stella accepted this with a single nod, the way children accepted things that satisfied the basic requirement of being an answer. Then, with the timing of someone who had been holding the question for a while, "Are you the one he looks at his phone and sighs about?" Logan closed his eyes briefly. Audrey pressed her lips together. Not quite a smile. Very close. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Maybe." She did not tell him that afternoon what she had spent the past week doing in whatever hours were left over from the hotel project. She did not mention the name Brett Holloway, or the questions she had started asking quietly through her own network, a contact at a commercial real estate firm, a lawyer friend who knew the New York market, a former colleague who had once worked adjacent to Prescott Group. What she had found was not complicated once she knew where to look. Brett Holloway was positioning himself as an alternative to Logan in the Calloway negotiation. He had been in contact with her father for weeks. He had a clear financial interest in the deal, collapsing a minority stake arrangement that would give him leveraged access to Prescott Group's portfolio if Logan's standing with the Calloways deteriorated enough. He was not protecting anyone. He was waiting the way patient men waited for a gap to open that he had been quietly widening himself. Audrey was not certain yet how to use what she knew. She was also not certain standing in an atrium in Midtown, while Stella explained her opinions about Gerald the fish to anyone who would listen, whether her next move should be about the contract at all. The formal dinner was Harold Prescott's idea. He framed it as a reconciliation, both families, a private room at a restaurant in the West 50s, an opportunity to reset the conversation in a more structured setting. Logan was told 3 days in advance. He agreed because he had run out of ways to avoid the architecture his father kept building around him, and because, if he was honest with himself, there was a part of him that had stopped wanting to avoid it. Audrey was told the same day. She came anyway because she had something to say, and she had decided she was going to say it. The room was everything. The service corridor of the Sterling was not white tablecloths, a long mahogany table. The formal geography of two families arranged across from each other with lawyers present, and the specific tension of people who have been polite for too long. Harold sat at one end. Walter sat across. Between them, the people they had produced, who had proven considerably more difficult to arrange than either of them had anticipated. Logan and Audrey looked at each other across the table and said nothing. They didn't need to. The recognition was immediate and complete, the same as it had been in the atrium, the same as it had been in the corridor, stripped now of every layer, except the one that had been there from the beginning. Then the door opened, and Brett Holloway walked in. He had been invited by Walter Calloway, who had been told Brett was a trusted industry voice with relevant context to share. Brett crossed the room with the ease of a man who had arranged exactly this moment, and was pleased with the arrangement. He set a leather folder on the table, opened it, and placed 2 items at the center, with the deliberateness of someone who had rehearsed this. The photograph was on top. Audrey in the service corridor, gray uniform, mop. Beside it, a printed transcript of Derek's phone call to Logan. The Calloway girl never showed with Logan's name at the top, highlighted. Both of them, Brett said, addressing the room with the measured gravity of someone delivering reluctant news, arranged to deceive your families on the same evening. I think that warrants a conversation about who you're actually negotiating with. Walter Calloway stood up. Harold Prescott looked at his son with an expression Logan had seen only once before the morning after Diana's accident, when Harold had arrived at the hospital and hadn't known what to say. Logan looked at Audrey. She was already looking at him. Her face was composed in the particular way it got when she was processing something quickly, and had decided not to show the processing. He recognized it now. He had seen it in the corridor when Derek's name had come through the phone. For the length of one breath, nothing moved. Then Walter said, "This partnership is over," and Audrey pushed her chair back and walked out. Not fast, not slow, just out. And the door closed behind her, and Logan did not call after her, because the room was still full of people, and Brett was still speaking. And somewhere across the city, Stella was at home waiting for him to come back. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Stella's babysitter. "She's asking when you're coming home." What should I tell her? Logan looked at Brett, who was still talking. He looked at his father, who had not moved. He looked into the closed door. He typed back, "Tell her soon." He wasn't sure yet if that was true. But he had made a decision sitting at that table watching Audrey walk out for the second time, with the same composed exit that had nothing to do with defeat. He was not going to let this end in a room full of lawyers. The days after the dinner had the particular quality of aftermath, not dramatic, not loud, just the steady work of living inside a situation that hadn't resolved. Logan went back to the office. He reviewed contracts, approved budgets, sat through 2 board meetings where no one mentioned the Calloway partnership directly, but everyone in the room knew it was gone. Brett Holloway had already been in contact with Walter Calloway's legal team. The window Logan had spent 18 months building toward was closing, and he could measure its closure in the specific way his CFO chose her words during their weekly call, careful neutral. The vocabulary of someone managing expectations downward. He did not tell his father he was sorry. Harold had not asked. What Logan did in the evenings was come home. He ate dinner with Stella. He helped her with the worksheet her teacher had sent home about fractions, which Stella approached with the deep personal offense of someone who had been asked to do something unnecessary. He read to her after 1 chapter of the book they'd been working through, about a girl who finds a door in her grandmother's garden that opens onto a different season. Stella always asked for 1 more chapter. He always said yes. It was during these evenings that the thing he couldn't name kept surfacing. Not grief, not regret. Something more like the specific frustration of having been close to something true, and then watching the machinery of other people's agendas dismantle it before he'd had time to decide what to do with it. He thought about Audrey walking out of that room, composed, no scene. He thought about Stella in the atrium, asking if Audrey was the one he sighed about. He thought about the service corridor at the Sterling, and a woman who had defended a stranger with the calm certainty of someone who simply didn't know how to do otherwise, and who had then told him without knowing who he was that Stella sounded like the best reason she'd heard in years to keep trying. He had been testing her that night. He understood now, sitting in Stella's room with the nightlight throwing its orange circle on the ceiling, that she had passed the test before he'd finished designing it. The problem had never been her. The problem had been whether he was willing to accept what he'd found. In Chicago, Audrey was working. She had submitted the hotel renovation proposal 2 days after returning from New York, received approval, and thrown herself into the execution phase with the focused energy of someone who had decided that productivity was a reasonable substitute for resolution. Her desk was covered in material samples and lighting schematics. Her calendar had no empty slots. She moved through her days with a purposefulness that convinced everyone around her, and convinced her not at all. Her father had not called. Cassie had. Audrey had let it go to voicemail twice before answering on the 3rd. Cassie's voice on the other end was different from usual, quieter, stripped of the brightness she usually deployed like a tool. The confidence was gone. What was left underneath it was smaller and more honest. "I need to tell you something," Cassie said. Audrey set down the material sample she'd been holding. "Okay, Brett Holloway called me about a month ago. He said he wanted to understand what happened at the Sterling. A beat that carried the weight of what came next. I had a photo from that night. I sent it to him." Audrey was quiet. "I told myself it wasn't a big deal," Cassie continued. "That you'd be fine, that you're always fine." Another beat longer. "I think I wanted something to happen that wasn't about you being fine, about you having everything handled. I've been in that shadow for a long time, Audrey. I know that's not your fault. I know it's mine. I wanted you to know." It was, Audrey thought, possibly the most honest thing Cassie had ever said to her. Not an excuse dressed as a confession, but an actual accounting, the specific, uncomfortable kind that required something from the person offering it. She didn't forgive her immediately. That wasn't how it worked, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of dishonesty. But she said, "Thank you for telling me." And she meant it. And that was enough for now, a door left open rather than locked. After she hung up, she sat for a long time at her desk, with the material samples, and the lighting schematics, and the quiet of a Tuesday afternoon in Chicago. Then she pulled up everything she had compiled on Brett Holloway and started building the presentation she should have built a week earlier. Walter Calloway was in his office when Audrey arrived unannounced at 8:45 on a Tuesday morning. His assistant started to say something. Audrey smiled at her, genuinely. Not as a performance, and said, "I'll be quick," and went in. Her father looked up from behind his desk with the expression of a man who had been expecting this and had hoped on some level that it wouldn't come today. Audrey set her laptop on his desk and opened it. She walked him through it, without editorializing Brett's financial position, the minority stake structure he had been quietly assembling over the preceding 6 months, the timeline of his outreach to Walter that mapped precisely onto the deterioration of the Prescott negotiation. She showed him the sequence how each piece Brett had fed him had arrived at exactly the right moment to do maximum damage, and how the story Brett had been telling was not about protecting the Calloway family's interests, but about creating a gap he could step into and then expand. Walter listened the way he listened, when something mattered completely, without interruption, with the stillness of a man running calculations behind a composed face. He was a man who had built a company from a regional contractor into a national firm by being willing to hear things he didn't want to hear. And whatever his faults, he was not someone who flinched from facts once they were in front of him. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Why didn't you bring this to me sooner?" he asked. "Because I needed to be sure," Audrey said. "And because I needed to know I was doing it for the right reason." Walter looked at his daughter across the desk, really looked the way he sometimes forgot to, when the business of running a business took up all available space. "And what's the right reason?" he asked. "Because it's true," she said. "That's all." Walter was quiet again. Outside his office window, Chicago was doing what it did on Tuesday mornings in November. Gray sky, purposeful pedestrians, the city moving without drama in any particular direction. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, "for the way I handled the dinner, and for not asking you at any point in this process what you actually wanted." Audrey accepted this without filling it with reassurance. "Yes," she said simply. "You do." Logan was in his car in the parking structure of his building when his phone rang. He didn't recognize the Chicago number. He answered anyway. "Mr. Prescott." The voice was Walter Calloway's, deliberate, measured with the texture of a man choosing his words carefully. "I think we need to have a conversation. Just the two of us, if that's agreeable." Logan leaned back in his seat. "It's agreeable. My daughter came to see me this morning." Logan said nothing. He waited. "She told me things I should have found out myself," Walter said. "That reflects poorly on me, and I'm aware of that." A measured breath carried across the line. "I'd like to understand what actually happened from you, not from lawyers, not from my associates. From you." Logan drove to Chicago the next morning. He met Walter Calloway in the man's actual office. Walter's desk, Walter's city. Walter's terms. Logan had chosen that deliberately. He sat across from a man he had never properly met, and said without preamble, "I came to the Sterling in disguise because I was afraid. Not of you, not of the contract. Afraid of marrying someone who wanted the life and not the person in it." He let that land before continuing. "I've done that once. I have a 6-year-old daughter who still sleeps with the hall light on because she lost her mother when she was 2. I was not willing to bring someone into her life who was there for the wrong reasons." Walter was quiet. "I was wrong to go about it the way I did," Logan continued. "It was disrespectful to your family, and to Audrey. I'm not asking you to excuse it. I'm just telling you what it was." Walter Calloway looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "My daughter did the same thing you know. The uniform, the early arrival." Logan absorbed this. "She didn't tell me why," Walter said. "I imagine the reason was similar." They sat with that for a moment, two men on opposite sides of a desk, both of whom had underestimated the people they thought they were protecting, both of whom were now sitting in the gap between what they had assumed and what had actually happened. "My daughter has never done anything for the wrong reason," Walter said finally. It was not offered as a boast. It was simply accurate, and he said it like a man who had needed to say it out loud in order to fully remember it. The Sterling service kitchen was closed between 2 and 5 on weekdays, that narrow window between lunch and dinner prep, when the back half of the restaurant stood empty and the overhead lights were left on low. Logan had arranged access through the general manager, who owed him a favor and asked no questions. Audrey was already there when he arrived. She was standing near the stainless steel prep counter, where they had stood that first night, wearing a dark coat. Hands in her pockets. She had not brought anything with her. Neither had he. There was nothing to bring. Everything that needed to happen in this room was going to happen in words. "I talked to your father," Logan said. "I know. He called me after." She looked at him steadily. "He said you were honest with him." "I tried to be." Logan came to stand a few feet from her, close enough to talk, far enough that nothing was assumed. "I should have been honest earlier. With you. The night at the Sterling when Derek called, I should have said something instead of just standing there. You didn't know what to say." "No." He held her gaze. "I still don't entirely know what to say. I just know that not saying it has a cost. I'm not willing to keep paying." He told her about Diana, then not the version he kept for public consumption, the clean narrative of loss and recovery, but the actual version, the marriage that had been two people performing compatibility for an audience, the slow erosion of pretending they were fine, and then the accident, and then the specific particular grief of mourning. Someone you had already lost in a different way, the way that left no clear language for what you were feeling. He told her about the 4 years since the wall he had built, the way it had started to feel less like protection and more like a room he was living in alone and calling it safety. Audrey listened without filling the space with reassurance, which was exactly right. She let him finish. Then she told him about a man named Ryan, not a villain she was careful about, that just a man who had looked at her and seen the Calloway name before he had seen her, and who had been kind enough about it that she hadn't noticed for almost 2 years. She told him what it had cost her, not dramatically, not with self-pity, just plainly to trust her own judgment after that. She told him that borrowing the uniform had not been about being clever. It had been about needing just once to see something real before the formal structure of 2 families and 2 contracts made real things impossible to find. "I saw something real," Logan said, "that night, before Derek called." "So did I," Audrey said. The kitchen was quiet around them, the specific quiet of a room that was built for noise and was currently holding its breath. They stood in it, and neither of them looked away. And Logan thought, this is what it feels like when you stop being afraid of the actual thing in front of you. Brett Holloway's arrangement with the Calloway family dissolved within the week, once Walter had his lawyers examine the stake structure Audrey had outlined. Brett made one phone call to Logan, a repositioning attempt, dressed as an apology smooth, and practiced the kind of call that assumed the recipient would appreciate the craftsmanship. Logan let it go to voicemail and did not return it. The Calloway contract was renegotiated over 6 weeks. It was a business agreement between 2 companies, built on terms both sides had examined honestly, and without the added weight of a marriage being used as its foundation. Harold Prescott and Walter Calloway signed it on a Wednesday afternoon, and Harold said something to Walter afterward that Logan didn't hear, and Walter laughed genuinely the way people laughed when something surprised them into it. Cassie came to Audrey a second time a few weeks later, with nothing to offer except the continuation of the conversation she had started. It was slow the way these things were not a single moment of resolution, but a series of small ones, each requiring something from both of them. Audrey made time for it, not because it was easy, but because Cassie had told the truth when she didn't have to, and that counted for something worth building on. The wedding was small. It was held in the garden of a rented house in Connecticut on a Saturday in October, when the trees were at the edge of turning and the light came in at a low angle that made everything look like it was being remembered rather than experienced. 31 people. No press. A string quartet that Stella had been allowed to approve, and had done so with the gravity of someone entrusted with a significant responsibility. Stella wore a dress she had chosen herself, pale yellow with a sash, and carried a small basket of flowers that she distributed with the focused intention of someone who had prepared for this role. Halfway down the aisle she stopped, looked back at Logan, and said at full volume, "Dad, you look nervous." Someone in the front row laughed. Then most of the other 30 people did too. Logan looked at his daughter. "I'm fine. You don't look fine." Stella considered him with the frank assessment of someone who had been studying this face her entire life. "But it's okay. Audrey looks fine enough for both of you." She was not wrong. At the reception, when the toasts had been made, and the music had moved from the formal portion to the part of the evening where people stopped worrying about what they looked like, Logan stood near the edge of the garden and said a few words. Not a speech, he'd been clear about that, just a handful of sentences to the people who had shown up. "I put on a janitor's uniform to test the woman my father had chosen for me," he said. "I was trying to find a reason to leave before anything started." He looked at Audrey, who was standing across the small crowd with a glass of wine and an expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "Instead, I found someone who was there for exactly the same reason I was." He let that settle. "What I actually needed to test was myself. It just took me a while to figure that out." The Stella Fund was announced the following spring, a grant program administered through the Prescott Group Foundation, supporting wage supplementation and emergency assistance for building services workers across the Prescott portfolio. Audrey had designed the framework. Logan had funded the first 3 years. They had named it together, and when they told Stella, she received the information with characteristic seriousness before asking whether the fish in the Prescott Group lobby would also benefit, because in her view, Gerald had been underfunded for some time. The answer to that was no, but they appreciated the advocacy. They were at a diner in Brooklyn, the 3 of them, a Tuesday night. No occasion when Stella asked the question. She had been working through a grilled cheese with the systematic attention she brought to most things, and she looked up without particular prelude and said, "Where did you and Mommy meet?" Logan and Audrey looked at each other across the table. The honest answer was a service corridor in a 5-star restaurant at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, when both of them were wearing someone else's uniform and trying to see something true before the world made it too complicated. It was not the simplest story to explain to a 6-year-old, but Stella had, in Logan's experience, a higher tolerance for complicated stories than most adults. "Your dad was mopping the floor," Audrey said. "And I was mopping the floor." Stella set down her grilled cheese. She looked at Logan, then at Audrey, running the logic. "So you were both working hard," she said. Logan looked at Audrey. Audrey looked at Logan. "Yes," Logan said. "That's exactly right." Stella nodded, satisfied, and went back to her grilled cheese. The diner was warm and unhurried. Outside, the street was doing what Brooklyn streets did on Tuesday evenings. In April, unremarkable, unphotographed entirely itself. Logan reached across the table, and Audrey's hand was already there, which was, he thought, more or less how it had gone from the beginning. Not perfect. Not arranged. Just 2 people who had decided at roughly the same moment, and for roughly the same reasons, to stop being afraid of what was actually in front of them. The truth had won. It had just needed a little time to find the right room.